paper under this project. The New Economic Policy Beyond 50, Evaluating Strengths and Flaws and Outlining a Cohesive Society, which has been authored by IDEAS Senior Fellow, Dr. Lee Hoffman. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them out into the Q&A box. Our moderator for the day, Ms. Meera Sivasothy, will be bringing them up during the panel discussion. We will also have time for questions at the end. We will begin our webinar today with some welcoming remarks from IDEAS CEO, Trisha Yeo. Trisha was unfortunately not able to join us live today, so we will be playing a pre-recorded welcoming message from her. Yes, thanks.
A very good morning to all of you. Thank you on behalf of IDEAS for joining us at this webinar. Today is the first of the 3 webinars over the next 3 days, where we'll be launching a policy paper each day on the subject of the much talked about, very controversial as well, new economic policy that has changed the economic landscape for Malaysia over the last 50 years. As IDEAS is an independent public policy think tank that engages in this sort of policy discourse, this year, in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Malaysia's new economic policy, IDEAS embarked on a research and advocacy project with the aim of revisiting and re-examining the success and shortcomings of the policy and its implementation in subsequent development plans. We wanted to facilitate a discussion that assesses the policy's relevance to Malaysia's current development needs 50 years since its inception. Alongside the policies themselves, we also noticed that the question of Bumiputra identity and social cohesion are also needed to be further discussed in the context of the last 50 years. So IDEAS commissioned these 3 policy papers on these topics that will be launched during these 3 webinars today, tomorrow, and last but not least on Friday. The first paper being launched today, of course, is by IDEAS Senior Fellow, and we're very happy to have Dr. Lee Hock Aun with us, who is no stranger to the subject. He has been speaking about affirmative action more broadly and the new economic policy specifically over the last few years, and this year he has been very prolific in writing about this as well. His paper titled The New Economic Policy Beyond 50, Assessing Its Strengths and Weaknesses to Chart a Cohesive Malaysian Society, challenges us to consider common misconceptions surrounding the NEP to avoid another 50 years of polarized debates on the policy. He directs us instead to focus on the NEP's underlying principles and enduring objectives, and to reflect on the shortcomings of the policy over the last years. He goes on to propose a way forward that builds on the NEP's 2 prongs and emphasizes the need to not terminate these policies, but to enhance them. We hope that through this paper, IDEAS is able to support the evolution of the discussion on NEP in Malaysia into one that is more meaningful and constructive. I look forward to hearing what the renowned and wonderful speakers that we have today will have to say. And thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for agreeing to be here this morning. And look forward also for those of you who are able to join us over the next 2 days as we explore the other 2 papers. One would be tomorrow by Professor Abdul Rahman Embong, looking at the NEP's impact on social cohesion and national unity. And the final one by Professor Wan Zawawi, exploring the impact of NEP on the question of indigenous people and the Orang Asli. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing what the papers will do to spark discussion in the country today. Have a good one.
Thank you, Trisha, for that warm welcome. We will now move straight into the presentation for today. And I will turn over the time to Dr. Lee Hoffman, author of our policy paper for today. Just some quick introductions. Dr. Lee Hoffman is a senior fellow at ISEAS-Yusuf Ishak and the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. He's also an associate research fellow at Malaysian Institute for Economic Research. Hoffman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vaisnavi, and I appreciate the opening remarks from Trisha. I want to thank IDEAS for initiating this project, and for me, an opportunity just to reflect on the NEP. I have given a lot of thought, but to revisit it in a way that also was delving into the origins. I took the opportunity on this 50th anniversary to do that, and as well to develop further some thoughts on where Malaysia can go from here. So yeah, I will have quite a lot to get through. Also, well, also on a personal note, this is quite meaningful. 20 years ago, 2001, I first joined University of Malaya, and Sulo was my head of department. Jomo was a colleague. That was also the year I met Ming. So it's a real honor and pleasure that they're on the panel today. And also appreciate YB Nurul, who sending in a video that will be shared later. I do have a lot to get through, and I hope to wrap up in half an hour. And so let me just dive in. That there will be, just give a sense of where we're heading. So first we'll be looking back. Now what I want to impress on us, above all, looking back on the NEP and evaluating strengths and its weaknesses, some things that we should reappreciate anew about the two prongs. And to recognize the key shortcoming. It was very extensive in affording opportunities to Bumiputras, but it really fell short in developing capacity, competitiveness, capability. I will be reinforcing these points. Now I want us to look at ourselves, at the discourse as well, the policy and our own thinking. And I think we have all contributed to the polarization and the stalemate in a few ways. One is, I think we get deadlocked in this mindset of, the debate where it's pitched continue versus terminate, the NEP as one big thing. And this kind of Big Bang approach that everything stays or everything goes. I think that is not only unhelpful, but it is also not well informed by history and empirical evidence. And the incoherent alternatives stem from the conflation of the NEP two prongs. I'll outline that. And there's also a lot of misguided, overblown, excessive bias in the empirical analysis. Now, all of that is going to be building towards what I propose is some way, it's just a framework that I think we can begin to be thinking how we can branch away from this polarized and deadlocked debate, moving away from this expiry date approach, this Big Bang approach, and we focus on what is enduring principles, and we look at policy design in a way that is dynamic and not fixated, right, on again, what needs to be terminated and what just needs to be perpetuated. And it will be anchored in two things, safeguarding equality and fostering fairness. Now, I will be referring to NEP 1970. The NEP actually was a slow release, well, it's a two-stage release. In 1971, as part of the Second Malaysia Plan, in 1976. 71, you could think of it more as a vision statement, right? It was broader, it was more inspirational, a bit more evocative in its language, and you can see already from the opening. The second, 1976, was the outline perspective plan. Actually, it's more or less 73, 74 in the midterm review of the Second Malaysia Plan. But of course, it was a landmark in 1976, and that was the full-fledged plan. So just an appreciation of what they look like, and also foreshadowing of what I'll be referring to later. So we begin with, yes, this reappreciation of the NEP, its strengths. We start, I think we want to get to full appreciation of its actual language as well. So this is the word for word about the two prongs of the NEP. First prong, to reduce and eventually eradicate poverty, irrespective of race. And the second, to accelerate social restructuring, to correct economic imbalance, so as to reduce and eventually eliminate the identification of race with economic function. They're very distinct, as you can see, keep it that way in our minds, because the problem, as I have said, is that they tend to be all meshed and conflated. But the second prong is what corresponds with affirmative action. Affirmative action as a concept that is applied around the world, which has specific objectives and specific instruments. And that's also where pro-Bumiputra preferences come into the picture. So let me unpack that a little bit further, why the distinction is very important, and that was a major contribution of the NEP. So, and let's go through that sequentially. So the first prong, its objective was pretty simple and straightforward: reduce poverty, which was about 50% in 1971, and the targeted reduction was to 17% in 1990. It also operated with a certain set of instruments, right? Basically, provision of basic needs, basic schooling, infrastructure, rural development, right? There was a focus on boosting income and on well-being at the base level, the lowest income households. Now, there's also a key feature of universal provision, right? Of equality. It's provided equally to every person. And also a feature of these areas is that there are minimal or zero barriers to entry. I'm raising that to draw more of a contrast, although I hope you can begin to see some of these important features about the two prongs. The second prong, its objective, was to promote Bumiputra participation and achievement. So contrast to poverty alleviation, participation and achievement in certain areas: higher education, high-level occupations, enterprise, and ownership. That's where they were lacking the participation and achievement. Its instrument, right, primarily involved preferential treatment based on identity. There were quotas, right, reservations especially. And the key feature was that it is group targeted. It's a group targeted allocation. It's more about the allocation of scarce opportunities, because there is a greater, more acute sense of scarcity in these areas. You contrast primary schooling with tertiary education. Primary schooling can be universal. All you need to do is provide it for everyone. There's no qualifying mark to enter school, but there are qualifying marks to enter university. So it can't be just something that you say, let's give it to everyone, and especially let's just let all the poor people into the higher learning institutions. More can be done, but the principle cannot be just universality, right? It's about targeted allocation, because there are barriers to entry, there's specialization. Now, ultimately, what was the objective of the NEP? It was not very clear. It was a little bit more implicit, been a little bit opaque. But I think what we gather from the NEP language was a few times where it refers to what is to be achieved within one generation. And in 1971, the NEP articulated it this way: Bumiputras would be full partners in the economic life of the nation. And I think that implies, demonstrates, I think, and more than imply, I think it demonstrates an awareness that there needed to be real empowerment so that the group could graduate out of needing to receive the overt preferential treatment. Now, it also had certain omissions and gaps. And I think some of these only dawned on me as I read through it a little bit more and dwelt on it a little bit more deeply, because it's something that I think is conventionally overlooked. Now, the NEP did have some conceptualization of how the two prongs, poverty alleviation and social restructuring, relate. And it characterized them as interdependent and mutually reinforcing. That's a good start, but I think it was not sufficient in how it formulated the scope and the mechanisms of the second prong. They do operate in those key areas, as I mentioned, right? And so I think if it was really targeted and we're aware that there are these particular areas of intervention, there would be a realization, possibly, right, that in some of, not all of these areas, you can just say target the poor irrespective of race. For many of these interventions, right, how it operates needs to really be about targeting those who are capable, right, targeting those who have potential to do, to thrive in these areas, right, in SMEs, in higher education. And it didn't really, also the NEP didn't really be very clear and I think systematic enough that the key feature of the preferential treatment for Bumiputras. I think if there was a little bit more self-awareness, it could have induced attention that because there was this preference, there needed to be some, there was need to graduate. And to do that, then you need to really focus on developing the capability and the competitiveness. there was such a vast range of interventions. I will come to some of that later to show that, which would also, and there was some inkling, right, that there, because of so many interventions, that there are different targets and there are sort of different timelines. But again, it didn't really develop that enough, right? So I think NEP allowed for the notion, right, the expectation that 1990 can be one single monolithic end date. That is, everything could, be dismantled in 1971. You see what it actually said in the second point there, that it was aware, the NEP was aware that it was very ambitious, and especially the creation of a Malay commercial and industrial community, in the word, to quote, may require a generation or more for their full accomplishment. So it was actually already aware that it's really massive, and 20 years is probably not enough, but it didn't actually develop, it didn't follow through by saying that, look, some areas are going to take longer, some areas are going to take less, right? And in any case, it wasn't even one big bang of introduction in 1971. So if it didn't all come in 1971, there's no way actually that it could all be taken away. If it wasn't all erected in 1971, it could not all be dismantled in 1990. Let me illustrate with higher education. I will be using higher education a little bit more because I think it's a bit easier to grasp as illustrations. In 1971, there was one public university, University Malaya. UKM and USM followed soon after, right? But even if we take 20 years as a reasonable time frame for a university to implement affirmative action, University Malaya was the only one in 1971, maybe until 1990. But what about University Utara Malaysia, which was established in 1984? Should it also have dismantled its affirmative action in 1990? Or should it have also carried on for 20 years? I'm not advocating the 20-year timeline as something across the board, but the point is that we have to look at it sector by sector, even institution by institution, rather than just 1990 as like everything is going to go away. Okay, it was illusory, it was not actionable and deliverable, a promise to dismantle in 1990 in the first place. So let's just dispense with that, all right? It's not helpful and it's not well informed. I mentioned this earlier, but oh yeah, because now we're getting to the difference between 1971 and 1976. So this within one generation goal, I think it was really significant because that phrase, those are choice words. In 1971, again, the objective within one generation was Bumiputra full partnership, right? I think it was suitably bold, but it was still ambiguous. By 1976, the within one generation goal had narrowed down to Bumiputra owning 30% equity. I invite you to publicly available documents, the second Malaysia plan, the third Malaysia plan. Please go ahead and read for yourself. Now that presages this dominance of, right, a certain obsession, a fixation with 30% Bumiputra equity. And you can see the effects of it because it does turn out to be a driving the NEP. It is the enduring motive. Another point about the NEP is, well, I mean, it is related, right? It's more of a context. And I think overall these criticisms as well, I'm not saying that, with a lot of expectation that they could have done all of this, but it's still in retrospect, I think important to realize those shortcomings because the NEP was crafted, in very fraught circumstances. But this is also another one, very important, I think, for context, which does shape the way that the NEP was framed and the way that people responded to it. So it was compromises forged out of ethnic bargaining in some ways that actually very little research has disclosed. So there was this assertion of Malay primacy. There was pushback from minorities. Finance Minister Tan Siew Sin, EPU Director General Tong Yao Hong were among the senior figures that were part of this. They were alarmed by how assertive and aggressive, in their words, this agenda was. And so with their intervention, even that phrase, poverty alleviation, irrespective of race, right, was inserted through their intervention. And then there was also another one, that no group will experience any loss or feel any sense of deprivation. Now, it's quite a noble statement, right? It's an aspiration, but I think it also contributed to really inflated and unrealizable expectations. because it wasn't, again, aware of the specific areas of intervention. The whole idea, the underlying idea here is that, okay, with economic growth, the economy can, keep generating jobs and then nobody will really feel left out. Yeah, that can happen, that there will be more jobs and to solve unemployment, but that does not change the fact that public universities, especially, are still going to have scarce places. And so there's going to be inevitably some give and take. So you cannot really, deliver on a promise that no one will feel deprived. It should have been more along the lines of, look, we'll try to really strive for a fair balance. And I think I also want to address another point here we'll come back to, which was that the first prong kind of doubled as with had a dual function, right? It was giving this assurance to the minorities that you're taken care of. So it was a bit of a code to say that we help the poor irrespective of race means that all Malaysians will have their interests taken care of. I just want to foreshadow that, coming back to that, because that has become quite inadequate. I think in the policy discourses, so those were from the public or the official statements in the NEP in 1971 and 1976. I think the responses, you can see that I was reading through it in some of the literature in the newspapers in the 70s and in the 80s, and it just keeps getting recycled over the years, and we still hear it today. This 1990 as sort of one monolithic expiry date, and even talking about the NEP as like one single entity. These are some of the things that I think contribute. I think they're misconceptions, and they contribute though to the polarization and the stalemate. And the equity ownership as the driver, right? That was been critiqued, but also sometimes on the other side, the opposition to the NEP hinges a little bit too much on that as well, and ends up reinforcing the thing that, the equity ownership, meaning to say that, as long as we can prove that NEP, that Bumiputera equity ownership exceeds 30%, then the whole case for the NEP collapses, and then it's going to be, abolished, right? It's just not going to work that way. Equity ownership estimation, the data, yes, need rigorous analysis, but that is not going, don't stake the whole critique of the NEP just on the equity ownership issue. Now, another one that has really quite a stranglehold, I find, it keeps getting reiterated. And even in these specific words, I think this is also there's some error in it, both in terms of its the thinking and as well as the evidence. The phrase, the NEP only benefits the Malay elite and it fails the masses. There's a lot more that can be said about it, but I do want to point out that I see that it gained traction in the 1990s. In the context of privatization, you had the rapid creation of these Malay corporate titans, runaway wealth accumulation, but it's much less relevant, or maybe not much, it's less relevant in the post-Asian financial crisis. I'm not saying that these issues about elite enrichment, about inequality are unimportant, but again, we need to be properly informed and put them in the right context, because I think it's often just overblown and empirically unsubstantiated. We keep hearing people saying inequality within Bumiputera is rising, it's the highest ever, right? And the evidence shows the opposite, actually. It superimposes one dimension and the most problematic. So it is, and I think a lot of the criticisms, are warranted and are substantiated, because that's where you have patronage, corruption, profiteering, right? It's in the equity ownership, equity redistribution domain. But don't superimpose that on the entire system. That's the problem, that everything gets tarred with the same brush, because it's just so much more. And I think there was a watershed in 2010. I want to dwell a little bit on this because, it's really, taken sort of permanent residency in a lot of people's minds. With the new economic model, right? Which, if hopefully you can begin to see why I like to call it the new economic model. So it actually became mainstream and even a little bit of bipartisanship in it. Now, don't take my word for it. Take the NEM's word for it, why it is such a muddle. So I want to read this out for us. Affirmative action programs and institutions. This is the NEM's summary statement about affirmative action. It said that they will continue, right? But in line with views of main stakeholders, will be revamped to remove rent-seeking and market distorting features that have blemished the effectiveness. It will consider all ethnic groups fairly and equally as long as they're in the low 40% of households. Affirmative action will be market-friendly and market-based, taking into consideration needs and merits of the applications. Now, these red ones that I'm highlighting are, of course, there to illustrate. So firstly, it said it would continue. There was no such thing about the NEM removing affirmative action. And it was overly focused on rent-seeking and market distorting. So certain aspects, but not all. It didn't touch on higher education. It didn't really touch on small loans. It was really touching on the crony capitalism. So it was fixated on that. It also superimposed that problem on the entire system. I don't know what he's talking about here about considering all groups fairly and equally. It did lead to a lot of B40 social assistance, which is the NEP's first prong, which is a different domain of policy. It's not anything to do with the Bumiputra affirmative action. And how is the market supposed to be taken into account needs and merits? There was never any detail. And even the last one, Equal Opportunities Commission, will be established to ensure fairness and address undue discrimination when occasional abuses by dominant groups are encountered. I mean, if you want to tackle discrimination, why do we need to specify the frequency, the occasional, and the perpetrator? You know, discrimination really should have be about law, about due process, and so on. So I think that statement too, you know, was really flawed and exposed a lot of the undue biases and just really erroneous thinking in the NEM. So it is not a bold reform. If there was some clear commitment to continue, it was overly focused on the elite enrichment problem and committed a lot of the misconceptions that I mentioned just now, right? And I think what happened was related to the NEP was that the NEM basically said, let's do social restructuring, the NEP's second prong, but let's use poverty alleviation instruments, right? Rather than the NEP, and I would say our new thinking, and what would be a new model, which is to really maintain the distinction between well-being based and pro-poor, and the other ones that are addressing group targeted and addressing participation and achievement. So it is very, very extensive. I've been saying this a lot, but just to illustrate, and the point, the purpose here is to overwhelm you with the detail, where it has all these interventions in higher education. And again, the NEM had nothing at all, no detail whatsoever on what was affirmative action, what it was talking about, what it was referring to. These are all the ones that are currently in place. It's not even an exhaustive list. And I think those that I bold are a little bit more in the backdrop, but I highlight them here. We'll come back to them later. So again, the sectors of higher education, employment, enterprise development, and wealth ownership. What I want to drive home here is that the decisive shortfall, right, about the policy is not that it doesn't reach out to the B40 and N40. Of course, there are shortcomings there, especially the very bottom, you know, code B20, right? But it does have such extensive outreach to, you know, to the gamut of Bumiputra society. The problem is that despite all of that, it has really still fallen short in developing capability and competitiveness. So what evidence can we refer to, right? So about this overall picture of society, especially in the ethnic categories. And this goes with the view that, oh, it's only benefited the elite and it has neglected the masses. So the NEP widens rich, poor, Bumiputra inequality. That's the view. Now, I just want to say as before that NEP, right, is so many, as we just saw, so many programs. And some can increase inequality if the rich disproportionately benefit. Some actually can reduce inequality, right? Higher education expansion, middle class growth. So we have to think of it as the net effect, right? And very cautious about a sweeping statement like the NEP causes one thing. But the overall picture, I think we can look at household income inequality and what is actually the trend, okay? Again, no, this is not my opinion. This is the most authoritative source, which is the household income surveys. So as I was saying just now, the view that it is rising inequality, I think it had validity. In the 1990s, there was a narrative that was supporting it, or there was a narrative that gave to that perception, and the empirical evidence was consistent with it. You see the rising inequality in the 1990s. This is the Gini coefficient Rising Gini means rising inequality, declining means falling inequality. And so you have that shown by the evidence. Now the same series, household income surveys, which survey about 80,000 households throughout Malaysia, a national representative sample, shows declining inequality in the last 15, 20 years. And where's the decline most marked? Within the Bumiputra community, and which community or category registers the lowest income inequality? Follow the red line. It's within the Bumiputra, right? So it's don't be so shocked at what I say, but really be shocked that we have totally ignored this evidence for about 15 years. This is another outcome that is consistent with declining inequality, but I think I want to unpack this briefly because it makes the link it makes the link between affirmative action, the policies, and inequality. Tertiary education, we can see here with the labor force share of the labor force with tertiary education, right? And from 1990 to 2018, and it shows here following the green line that the most rapid gains. It has gained in all groups, but most rapidly in Bumiputra, right? And rising share of labor force with tertiary education, right, would decrease the earnings premium for holding tertiary education. You know, many countries have experienced this declining inequality that corresponds with growing share of or expansion of tertiary education. So it's quite plausible, right, that inequality has declined in Malaysia. But the other point is the disparity within the Bumiputra community between Malay and non-Malay, which shows up here, that the X of Malay and triangle non-Malay Bumiputra. Well, there's, we can come back if there's more interest in this, but I do want to say that another point that is 2013 was the last time that this was reported. So the statistics have omitted the distinction, and we are not even tracking this disparity very much, but it is a very, very important one. Maybe this we come back later if there are further questions on unpacking it when I say that we need to incorporate need-based and merit-based together with identity, and not just think of need-based and merit-based as totally replacing them. But here, if maybe we can see how this is a schematic for seeing how they actually relate to each other, and how need-based considerations, meaning to say giving a bit more preference and identifying disadvantage to provide opportunity to them, can reinforce the way that the system operates. Currently, of course, mainly for Bumiputra beneficiaries. Primarily that operates in higher education, right? But there is a lot more limited scope for that to operate in other areas. If you think about enterprise development, in higher education, we can move away from race-based, right, towards a little bit more of so-called need-based, because you can target more poor students to enter university. But you can't do that in many of the other areas. If it's about SME development, if it's about public procurement, you can't really give contracts to poor households. You have to give it to people who actually have the ability to do it. So we can come back to that, but I wanted to then move on to this for, I think towards the closing. So having journeyed through the 50 years of the official articulations and some of the criticisms that I think are important for us to consider, how do we move forward from here? So my approach, and well, another point again, just to reiterate, I think what we want to move away from is this debate. It's deadlocked, where we think where it and both sides close ranks, and tends to be aligned with a majority group view and a minority group view that just continue the NEP. It hasn't finished its business. On the other side is terminate it. All the more you're supposed to terminate in 1990. Right? 1990 was not really even an achievable promise. But this whole standoff, this kind of perpetual clash, it really will continue unless we can find a new way to think about it. So that is the spirit of what I'm trying to propose here. And we don't really need to fixate on just burying the NEP, because it actually had value, especially in the two prongs. But what we can do is to expand on it, to bring it up to date. So from reducing poverty, as the first prong, I propose safeguarding inequality. That corresponds, but it's a lot broader and richer. And restructuring society to foster fairness. And it corresponds because, and through this, we align what is the objective, what is the principle, the instruments. So equality focuses on rights, dignity, well-being, and it has specific areas of application. And this is where also the assurance to all Malaysians, right, can be much more, can be grounded in something that is much broader and richer, rather than we still hear that today, oh, help the poor irrespective of race. I mean, we're still hearing that as sort of, you know, sort of a fallback to say that, okay, we'll take care of everyone. The 12 Malaysia plans still use that language, that it's going to be about helping the poor irrespective of race. To move on, I think, and to really, that is more consonant with Malaysia today, would be to guarantee equality, safeguard in equality. We don't talk about equality, but apply that specifically in rights, dignity, well-being. And the principle of fairness can drive, right, the achievement of promoting opportunity, of promoting participation, capability, and achievement. Again, specifying the areas. See, there's been so much progress in Malaysia. People are aware of, you know, there's been social protection, expansion, middle class. People are aware of rights. They're more assertive about that. I think it's time that all of that also translates into the overall development vision. We've also seen, right, there are more group-targeted policies. They're still minimal, but we've seen more for women, for Orang Asli, for Indian communities. So again, not only fixated on race, but broadly about identity, and seeing that these programs that can be targeted at different groups are part of one policy domain. And we just need to integrate it better and strive for a better balance. There are weaknesses. I've talked about the NEP quite a bit. I mean, it's something to overcome is that, well, it had the simplicity, right? You just have one target and then you focus, you know, and then you just pursue it. 30% Bumiputera ownership, then just pursue it. But I think we have seen after 50 years of that is really inadequate, right? And it can really go awry in many ways. There will be a need to let go of prevailing mindsets. I think another aspect is the politics. And you know, the long-term plan, 20-year plan, even 10-year plan with very definite targets and all that. I think that is really of a bygone era. I mean, it might come back, who knows? But in the moment, right, with all the fluidity, I think that it's also a good opportune to be looking more at discussing more, right? What are the enduring principles? And to build on something, a new vision, right? That is not just wedded to one coalition's, you know, short-term objectives or their numerical targets. So wrapping up now, just again presenting some proposals for cohesive Malaysian society. There's a purpose, and we have the principles of equality and fairness with distinct purposes about well-being, dignity, and rights, and that can be granted on the basis of equality. Fairness is the guiding principle for promoting participation and representation, right? Equality is overly binding and it's unrealistic as well. Not to say it's totally irrelevant, right? But you know, I think that fairness would be the better, more approach, both conceptually as well as practically. Coming back to what I said at the beginning about the importance of the two prongs. So let's really maintain the clear distinction. The various interventions operate on the basis of universal access, right? Guaranteeing standards, providing basic provisions. Whereas group targeted interventions, they often do involve preferential treatment. Pro-diversity policies can fit in there. And then some of the key policy areas, which I think have been already discussed. So just closing, I think it might still be helpful with some examples, right? Because you know, so far it might still be a little bit more abstract. And in the paper, I do expand on that a little bit more. But I think for university again, which is a good one for illustration, I draw on some of the research I did on South Africa, right? So right now, we really don't have anything besides just the grades, and then we have 90% or 10% non-Bumiputera quota in matriculation, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction, right? And we get kind of entangled in, you know, how are we doing for time? Okay, briefly, yeah, we don't really have we haven't formulated a way to balance, right? Do we give access to the poor? What about merit, right? And every year it seems like it's just reactive because there's a poor non-Malay student with very high grades who doesn't get in. Oh, and then someone intervenes, and that's about it. Whereas something like what happens in University of Cape Town, where they have one round of applications or the evaluation totally based on the academic achievements, right, and abilities and all of that. And so you don't take into account, the socioeconomic background. And then another round where socioeconomic background factors in, right? And then another layer, or I should say layer, that also takes into account trying to strive for diversity, okay? So that kind of thing, it's really, I think, just want to propose that as a starting point, and to begin to see that identity and need and merit, they're not conflicting. It's not that we can say need only and get rid of any identity-based considerations, but find a way to integrate all three. I think it's important for Malaysia to be looking at some of the institutions that are now monoethnic, that are now exclusively Bumiputra, to open them up. Now, this is not totally new. It's happened in the past, right? With the Amanah Saham that has, later opened up to participation to all Malaysians, with Tekun microfinance, which has one program for the Indians. But I think to be strategic in about that, and I mentioned earlier one like Yayasan Peneraju. Now, why? Its raison d'etre is actually to reach out to disadvantaged students, right? But only to Bumiputra disadvantaged. And I think that's really, that grieves me a little bit. And I think especially for certain communities like the Indian community, they don't have access to something like this. And also it's only about 10 years old, so there's much less baggage. Now, specific ideas like this, I think, need to be part of the conversation rather than the kind of sweeping statements. And I think it will move along as well, so that we can begin to see that this kind of change is possible. Malays and Bumiputras can begin to see that opening up is not a threat, right, to them. And others can begin to see that, and I guess, all can begin to see that, we can, and it builds sort of a certain momentum. And I think building trust again between the groups is important. And I think PUNB was another one, which is microfinance. I think it can take the similar route of going from being exclusively Bumiputra then to opening up to become more inclusive. So I think with that, thank you so much for your attention. Sorry for exceeding by 5 minutes. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Hwok Aun, for that comprehensive presentation of your paper. So I will now go ahead and pass the floor to Meera Sivasothy, General Manager of BFM Media and presenter, who will be our moderator today. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Great presentation, Hwok Aun. I had to read 10,000 of all those words in your paper over the last couple of days. And it was great to actually listen to some of the perspectives that you put forward in that paper. And that's something that we want to actually discuss. And I think we've got a great panel today. We all know the NEP remains contentious and it's a very sensitive issue. And today, let's have this honest but critical discussion about the NEP. I think we've already got some questions coming through. Send them through. We want to talk about what has worked, what are some of the omissions and gaps. After 50 years, where should we go as far as affirmative action initiatives are concerned? How do we rework the NEP to forge a cohesive Malaysian society? When I look through your slides on the cohesive Malaysian society, Hwok Aun, I have to say that you are really an idealist. I wish, it sounds like utopia, but at least there is somebody who's got hope and has put it down in paper, something that we can help guide us towards and help open our minds beyond what we already know. So Hwok Aun has detailed examples and he shared his views on how he imagines this cohesive Malaysian society should be. So send through your questions in the Q&A box or whichever platform you're on. You could be on Facebook as well. Just put it in the comments and the team will actually send it through to me. So we know the NEP's objective was two-pronged in 1971. Simple: eradicate poverty and restructure society to eliminate the identification of race with economic function. And of course, the overarching objective was for national unity. Now, the question of whether we've achieved national unity, let's not even go into that yet. But joining me on the panel today to help share their views and their perspectives on Hwok Aun's paper, as well as, based on what they understand of the NEP, Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Senior Advisor at Khazanah Research Institute. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Professor Dr. Sulochana Nair, Vice Chancellor of Bangi University. Professor Sulo. Are you there? Yep. And Dr. Ong Kian Ming, MP for Bangi. Kian Ming?
Hello.
Wonderful. We also have an 8 to 9 minute presentation, or just her views. Sharing her views is Nurul Izzah Anwar, MP for Permatang Pauh. We'll play her views as we go along with the discussion, and we will comment on what she has to say as well. I'm just going to quickly start with just to get this conversation started off. Hwok Aun has actually shared what has worked in the NEP. Prof. Jomo, what do you think has worked as far as the NEP is concerned?
Obviously, my views are really much more about what the NEP means. The NEP is like the proverbial Indian elephant, which means many things to different people. Yeah. And has spent his lifetime really working on the NEP and NEP-related issues in a comparative perspective. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that what you mean by the NEP working or not working depends on what you mean about what you think the NEP is about. And I would basically argue that for most people today, half a century later, the NEP is really a code word for affirmative action, what was used to be called society, as well as positive discrimination. Now, Malaysia is not unique in undertaking policies of positive discrimination. If we look, for example, at what has happened in other parts of the world, you look at, for example, right after the Civil War, the Americans promised freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. And more recently, after Martin Luther King's, during the 1960s, civil liberties, civil rights were extended to African Americans and other ethnic minorities, and there were very important developments at that time. In India, we've had over a century of affirmative action for scheduled castes, for scheduled tribes, and so on and so forth. In South Africa as well, one could well argue that apartheid represented a form of affirmative action for the rural Afrikaner community who felt oppressed by and marginalized by the Anglophone white community. So it was white versus white, but it was still a form of affirmative action. And then more recently, of course, we know about Black economic empowerment, which interestingly came from the NEP and now has been re-imported into Malaysia as Bumiputra economic empowerment. So I think we have a very, very interesting history in this country. And unfortunately, and this is why I think Hwok Aun's work is so important, and why it is very timely for IDEAS to actually organize this series of discussions. But I think we need to have the larger perspective, and Hwok Aun has done an excellent job in reminding us about this. But it is extremely important that we think very seriously about what all this means, especially because we have had a number of slogans over the half century, which have offered to change the discourse. And the question, and in fact, arguably even before that, if we think about, for example, what did it mean for the British to set up RIDA, the Rural Industrial Development Authority, and give it as a means for Dato' Aun to continue his political career after he lost the presidency of UMNO. It was a form of using affirmative action to prop up his career at that time. Or what did it mean for the Reid Commission to make its provisions for ethnic provisioning and so on and so forth? So I think we have to look at May 69 and the 1971 enunciation of the NEP, and also very importantly the Rukun Negara, in light of an attempt, flawed as it was, to address what was perceived to be the dominant discourse coming out of May 69. It was essentially seen as May 69 represented and was seen as basically an inter-ethnic clash. But if we look more carefully at the electoral results, we will find that almost half the Malays in the peninsula actually voted against the ruling alliance coalition at that time. And so to think of the whole of May 69, as we often do in terms of of inter-ethnic differences, actually misses the point. Undoubtedly, before that, many non-Malays felt very aggrieved that their opportunities were being thwarted by a Malay-dominated government. And conversely, we find that many Malays felt that they were not progressing, and because of the non-Malay dominance in various parts of the country. Now these were of course misperceptions in my view, but these were misperceptions which were actively fostered by the political parties at that time, because the more ideological politics of the 1950s and 40s had been basically eliminated during the 1960s, especially with the political repression. Professor Sulo's mother-in-law was sort of victim of this, and it's very important for us to recognize that there was once a time when there were different types of politics on offer in this country, and that was largely eliminated by the repression, particularly in the early and mid-1960s, especially in the mid-1960s. And so when Tun Mahathir concludes the NEP period by offering Vision 2020, Wawasan 2020, and a corresponding view of Melayu Baru, that vision is actually contesting and rejecting the view of Abdullah Ahmad, who was trying to make a political comeback cynically by touting Ketuanan Melayu. So I think it's very important for us to look at the NEP not simply in terms of of what it professes to do, because everybody, there are all kinds of people who will claim that they were responsible for this and that about the NEP, or for the NEP not being what it was. And this, I think, is extremely important. So what we need to recognize is that many of the inter-ethnic differences, gaps, which did exist, for example, in the half a century ago, have actually been closed. But instead, the ideology of what I call ethno-populism has become so dominant that we do not recognize, for example, that while we are, that for example, in terms of share ownership used to be, foreign share ownership used to be about 60% of a much, much smaller economy in half a century ago. Now it is about half, but what we are doing in the name of shared prosperity, or whatever the latest slogan might be, is fighting over the remaining half, okay? The remaining half, which is basic, and roughly, depending on how you calculate it, whether it's market prices or at par value, you will find that about 40% is in Bumiputra hands, at least at par value, and probably about half in terms of market value, compared to 60% at par value for non-Bumiputras. So, we have seen that how Malaysian society is so animated over what is seen to be as the vestiges of the NEP, that we have not had much of an alternative discussion. Also, I think, if we think about the alternatives, it has been posed in terms of, ideas, particularly in terms of a certain view of what is professed to be a liberal vision of an alternative. And this often is opposed to, say, for example, much more progressive fiscal policy. I mean, the rising debt levels in this country are not accidental. They are a deliberate result of the fact that successive governments have refused to impose more taxes, and certainly more direct taxes. And also a view about trade liberalism, which in my view is rather naive. And then there's another view, of course, which proposes meritocracy as the alternative. But as Michael Sandel of Harvard has reminded us, meritocracy is often the ideology of the educationally privileged, and at the expense of others. And then yet another is, of course, this talk which Dr. Lee has reminded us of about need and the need for sort of more selective targeting and so on and so forth. But we often ignore the high cost of targeting and the implications of targeting as opposed to universalism. So these are very, very important and choices. But I think what we really need is we need to step back a little bit and to recognize that we are now in a very, very dangerous, we've been stuck for over half a century in a very dangerous discourse of ethno-populism. And this deprives us of much more progressive alternatives. And this, I think, is the tragedy of this country. Thank you.
Okay, which I'm going to build on. Natusha Naidu has asked in her in the comments, thank you for your comprehensive presentation. Hwok Aun, how can policy analysts effectively communicate to politicians and the public the NEP's revision without getting lost in racialized political rhetoric, which is exactly what Prof. Jomo is talking about. Kian Ming, you want to just comment on this one?
Thanks, Meera. I think Natusha's question is an important one, and it's something that I've also been grasping with and grappling with as a politician and a former academic. I think it's important for the narratives that people like Hwok Aun and Professor Jomo, has been talking about to be communicated to the politicians first, to make them understand the nuances in the debate in a very polarized setting where many politicians are forced to take one side or the other, number one. And secondly, even when talking about the NEP, many politicians want to use simple solutions like going to, what Hwok Aun has talked about, a very simplistic needs-based approach and not really explaining some of the complications and nuances of actually adopting that approach in the different economic as well as education sectors. So, the conversation actually has to start with perhaps a smaller number of politicians who are able and willing to understand those issues at a more nuanced level. And then from then on to maybe educate more of the politicians from all sides. And then, God willing, hoping for more saner hits to prevail, we can have much more matured discussion on these topics, moving forward. Because even when I look at the comments and the questions, everyone is actually coming from their own preconceived experiences and notions, and that actually prevents us from having a more mature and nuanced discussion, which Hwok Aun and others are trying to approach.
Yeah. Dr. Sulo, you have any comments? Sorry, Hwok Aun, you wanted to add on?
Go ahead, Sulo. You were about to start. I can follow up.
Okay.
Okay, when I read Hwok Aun's paper, I said things haven't changed. Hwok Aun is still the idealist that I knew a long time ago. And when I read his paper and I looked at the various alternatives that he's proposing, I'm just asking myself, what is the reality on the ground because I work on the ground and I deliberately work on the first prong of the new economic policy. And when it started, it was very clear-cut, and the approaches and the instruments that they used. Let me talk about the approaches. It was a target group approach. They identified target groups within the population, and these target groups were identified as being in various sectors of the economy. And along the line, as we go, as we move on with the various development plans, the target group approach has actually been lost. And there have been various debates, discussions, etc., on poverty. And when I read one of the points that you raised, Hwok Aun, that they want to use the instruments of poverty eradication to achieve the second prong of the new economic policy, I almost got a heart attack. The reason being that it has, the instruments are not clearly defined. The instruments have not even succeeded in dealing with poverty. What more for the second prong, which is far more complicated? So, and also they used existing institutions, existing policies and programs of institutions, hoping that it would have an effect on poverty levels. And actually, over the years, when you look at poverty and how Malaysia has succeeded in poverty eradication, it's not been because of instruments or policies that have been clearly articulated to eradicate poverty. It's because of economic growth. So it's not the instruments, it's not the policies, it's not the strategies. The one exception to this would be things like microcredit, the Amanah ISEAS projects, which are clearly have had benefits for the target groups. But other than that, the bulk of it's been just by chance that poverty has come to a negligible level compared to the days of when the new economic policy was launched. And even though the mantra or the slogan was to eradicate poverty irrespective of race, but when you looked at 1971 and poverty, who were the poor at that point, or the majority of the poor? It was still the Bumiputra. So I think this point is very important, that both prongs of the new economic policy actually targeted the Bumiputra, even though it says irrespective of race. And over time, this policy has evolved. And if you look at the 12th Malaysia Plan, even though you say the language is the same, but the NEP is not even mentioned. You see, they're talking about Chapter 5 of the new economic policy, talking about restructuring the approach, transforming the approach towards poverty eradication, talking about multidimensional poverty index, talking about expanding the poverty, changing the poverty line. And that is only because there was such a furrow raised by Philip Alston when he came, and he said that the poverty line is not, that's why Malaysia revised its poverty line and had a new methodology for deciding who is poor. And also, there are, the poverty problem has not been solved yet. There are still pockets of poverty. There are still areas that have been left behind. You just have to go to the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur to see the kind of conditions under which Malaysians live. And then we are talking about doing all kinds of things at the other end of the spectrum. When we go to the ground, we see the reality, the stark reality of people struggling to earn a living, whether it's urban or rural areas. And also the other dimension that is very important is that a lot of the rural poverty has actually come to the urban areas, and it has taken on a very multidimensional character, multidimensional and a multi-ethnic character, because the poor are now amongst all the ethnic groups. Yeah. So the question is, the new economic policy, even though it is not articulated as such, continues to be relevant, because even the first prong has not been adequately dealt with. I think I'll stop there for a bit, Meera.
Sure. Hwok Aun?
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much for the panelists. I mean, this is more a conversation, so I don't think there's so much about responses. But I think, we are just sort of a bit building on each other and addressing Natusha's question. But first of all, yes, I guess I've been assigned the idealist label, so I have to take it. There is some idealism, of course, and I would gladly also admit, yes, I'm naive, but I would add, choose your naivety, right? It's not just like you're naive to think that this kind of change happened, and you're being realistic to say that we'll just demand the NEP ends. That's sort of, and so it's very naive, I think, to also say that as long as the minorities, as long as a growing chorus of people will say, would condemn the NEP enough, that it's just going to go away. Because, as I already said, there's not even really a premise to be able to begin to execute something like dismantling the NEP. It's already so embedded, and already there's so much progress, and you get really entangled as well. If you are then against group targeted policies that favor Bumiputra, but then you welcome group target policies that favor Indian community, that favor Orang Asli, that favor women, right? So this kind of illogic is also a bit of a part of the problem. I think it self-undermines the people who would like to, who would have that kind of inconsistency. I think can I just share something again on the slides? Because yes. I have thought about this, and it's about the communication. So I think one aspect of it is that, there's all this code, people speak in code. And so the past 10 years, there was this need-based, race-based. And of course, we're looking back the last 3 years, especially right with the 2018 election and sort of the Pakatan coalition that became wedded to the notion of need-based. Now, actually, in Pakatan's 2018 campaign, it was replete with promises for Bumiputra policies. It did not make any commitment at all to dismantle affirmative action. It did not say anything at all about need-based affirmative action. But that doesn't matter, right? Because it's about association, it's about, about code, it's about symbolism. But the problem is that they take on a life of their own. And I think Pakatan became associated with need-based, and need-based became associated with ending race-based, because it was always presented in this very, very, nebulous and incoherent way, but attractive, that we do need-based and everybody is happy. And we get rid of this race-based that a lot of people don't like, especially the minorities. So what was really, really striking, and I don't see that this was really covered much at all, these findings from a Merdeka survey, just go to the bottom of this slide here. Right, so it asked the same question, and conducted a survey in April 2018 and March 2019 based on the list, 2 of the most important issues. Okay, and I believe this was certainly Peninsular, I think nationally as well, representative. So everyone fixated on, it's all about inflation. Yes, if you ask people what is most important, is it to have your Malay rights, or is it to have a job and to be able to afford food? Obviously, the vast majority will say inflation. But the second one actually was even more insightful, I found, because in March, before the election, April 2018, the share of Malays who said preservation of Malay rights was 7% as one of 2 important issues, right? Chinese, 22%. So the question by Merdeka, I clarified with them, was that if you were Malay, you were asked this question, preservation of Malay rights. So they had sort of a sorting. If you were Chinese, the question was posed to you, fair treatment, or the statement was fair treatment of all races. But what happened 1 year later, March 2019? The share of Malays, and this was the second highest group after inflation, was 21%, preservation of Malay rights. So that sense of a certain quote unquote threat, right, or apprehension, anxiety really escalated. And not because Pakatan was really going, really promoting or saying a lot about need-based, but just because of what people associated. But and then the Chinese, right? Fair treatment of all races, that also really escalated. So this is, I think, really capturing a lot of what was happening on the ground. That there were these heightening tensions in opposite directions, because no one was really driving the narrative. You become associated, Pakatan was associated with need-based, and they were still saying need-based, but they were not clarifying that we say need-based, but we're actually not going to take away MARA, we're not going to take away, Amanah Saham. They were not going to do all of that, but they allowed themselves to be a target because they didn't actually explicitly say that. And I think they were fearful of saying that because then they would fear that their base, the minorities, would then start to feel that, oh, you're betraying us because why are you now supporting this Malay institutions that are providing for the Malays? And the anxiety as well, I think, is real. And it's not just something that I think a lot of people have been dismissive, especially in this sort of urban, very highly educated circles, that it's just a phantom kind of threat, that it's the elites manipulating the masses to feel insecure. When you think about how it might affect real people, they will be thinking, well, are you going to take away my MARA technical education? Are you going to take away those microfinance opportunities? I think it's pretty rational for them to be concerned that you spouting need-based without any details is going to possibly, and certainly can be played up, it can be inflamed, it can be politicized as, right? Pakatan, DAP, again, all right, the whole anti-Melayu thing, right? So that's why
can I interject? Since you bring up Pakatan so much, and I think I need to give a couple of 2 cents as well. I think that the figures that you show from Data Center are interesting, especially in terms of the increase in the people saying preservation of Malay rights among the Malays, fair treatment of all races among the Chinese. And I think that's part and parcel of the very polarized political setting in 2019, when UMNO and PAS were attacking Pakatan for not being pro-Malay enough. And then many Chinese were attacking Pakatan for not apparently fulfilling our promises in the manifesto. That deserves a separate discussion, right? But let me go back to the issue of being naive. Hwok Aun. I don't think you're naive. I think you're being practical, right? And as the only politician in this group here, I can tell you, and I also can share very frankly with all of the people who are listening in, have given comments, most of whom are non-Malay, non-Bumiputra. The fact of the matter is that if you want to approach this political question of the NEP by saying that I want NEP to be removed, it will never happen. You want to, sort of like, take the bull by its horns, you get got by the bull. That is my own experience in the political sphere. That is something that, it takes a very concerted and strategic effort over a long period of time to try to move the needle. So I think for those who are sort of like questioning very hard the underlying basis of the NEP and perhaps wanting to take the approach that Hwok Aun talked about just now, which is the non-idealistic approach. Get rid of the NEP. Don't think that it will materialize in your lifetime. Yeah. So what are the options moving forward? I think the options moving forward is basically to show better models or alternative models of how to improve some of the programs under the NEP or NEP type programs lah. Even though NEP doesn't appear in the 12 Malaysia plan. I just did a quick search just now. It appears, the word Bumiputra appears more than 270 times. And it's in the context of equity ownership, economic empowerment programs, inequality. So it is still a very important agenda in government policy, and it will continue to do so moving forward. But, what are the alternative models that I referred to? I released a press statement this morning, and I shared it with some of the panelists as well, sharing about my experiences going to the MARA Digital Mall. I'm not sure whether you guys still remember, but this program was launched by the then Minister of Rural Development, who is now the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Ismail Sabri. Right? I went to the MARA Digital Mall, and out of the 5 floors, only 1.5 was still selling IT or digital equipment, and about half of the stalls and also stores were actually closed, not in operation. Right? So this actually shows me that if, let's say, your underlying business model that's proposed by the government is not sustainable, the whole venture will collapse. and it will actually harm the Bumiputra community, both employees as well as business people. And I think as politicians, both Malay and Bumiputra and non-Bumiputra, we need to actually highlight these kinds of issues in the public to show that without good policies, even your Bumiputra economic and power policies will fail. And what are the alternatives? Alternatives that I brought up in my press statement included companies like Farm Fresh, a non-Bumi owned company, but they employ thousands of Malay distributors in the semi-urban and rural areas as people to store and sell their milk produce to other other people in the Malay community in the rural areas. I pointed to the example of this IT hypermarket that you see in all of the shopping malls. If you notice, you go to these IT for all hypermarkets, right? At least half of the staff there are Malays, right? They provide the same level of service as the non-Malay staff, very responsive, very attentive. And it is, these kinds of companies that give good employment to all Malaysians, including, the Bumiputra company. And I pointed to one last example of an IT company, a tech company called Slurp. Two Malay partners, one Chinese partner. They've been together for over 10 years. They happen to be operating in my constituency of Bangi. And they are the ones who design, operate, and maintain all of the payment and touchscreen systems in the Petronas kiosk that you guys would have frequented in Malaysia. And it's best in class. It's better than Shell. It's better than Petron. It's better than the other petrol kiosks that are owned by international companies. And this is a Malaysian company with diverse shareholding among its partners. Right. So these are relevant examples, especially in the tech sector, that we can talk about. And let's not get stuck in the muck in terms of revisiting old arguments, which are important to revisit. But let's look to new models in the future that we can discuss, I think, in a more hopeful and perhaps like what Hwok Aun say, more naive kind of manner. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kian Ming. I think, sure.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Kian Ming. I mean, that was really adding on. But I just want to say, again, coming back to the equality and fairness that I was proposing, and where the communication, I think, political communication to the people. I think we want to acknowledge that there is this yearning, right, for Malaysians. They want to know that, look, what's my stake? How is the system looking out for me? And actually, some of it is really just about clarifying. What are the things that operate for all? It's not just about the poverty alleviation, because that also remains stuck in the NEP mindset. That's a very important one. I thank Sulo for bringing those up. But public schooling, that's for all. That is something that is providing and has a role as well, in everything, including poverty reduction, a minimum wage, right? These are the ones that are providing on the basis of equality. Everyone who gets it will have the same minimum wage. There's no Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra differences. The public health system, right? So, and so I think that there's a lot more that can be said and to build upon. And I think to grow the awareness, right, about all the things that are provided on the basis of equality and providing well-being. And then clarify that this other area, they are group targeted. And I've adopted this language a little bit more because for a decade already, it's like put on the spot. Are you for race-based or are you for need-based, right? And then I say, well, race-based, but blah, blah, blah. But once you say that, once you don't condemn race-based, then you're in this camp, right? If you're supported in some way, then you're placed in a certain camp. And so I feel that also some of that language is where, if we can look at it as a set that is a group targeted, which also for Bumiputra can be for targeting Indian, and also women, not just about race, right? Disabled. And these are already, part of the fabric. It's really about just reframing it, right, in a way that, again, is striving for balance and trying to, avoid and being practical and avoid the needless conflict. Thanks.
Yeah, as you said, need, merit, identity-based policies, because you've got single mothers, you've got a whole lot of people outside of race. Prof. Jomo, you want to add on to the conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of the debate between Dr. Lee and Dr. Aung an interesting debate, but I really think that it still is within the realm of existing policies. And I think the big problem we need to recognize is that we have a situation in Malaysia where the shape of the debate has been very much constrained by precedent. And we are actually quite narrow. We think we are very universal, we are very international and so on. We are actually very narrow because we are actually referring to what we think happened in the past. In fact, Professor Sulo has done work on this. What happened, for example, in terms of helping farmers has actually changed very, very significantly over the decades. In the old days, there used to be extension agents and a lot of support of a different type compared to now. If you look, for example, even way back in the 1970s and 1980s, there used to be nutrition support programs. Yeah. Those programs have basically have disappeared. So one which some of us have proposed, for example, which actually would have very widespread implications, given the acceleration of climate change. 2 planting seasons in Muda have been cancelled and so on and so forth. How do you deal with this problem? One of the things we are recommending is that we need to go into things like, for example, having a school feeding program. Japan introduced the school feeding program universally in Japan a century ago, when it was poorer than Malaysia is today. So we can afford a school feeding program, but we don't do that. Why? Because we are fiscally constrained. And we don't want to introduce taxes because it is politically unpopular to introduce taxes. But we really need to address some of the bigger problems which we are just, avoiding. So, when Najib was Prime Minister, he introduced a debt ceiling, but he got around the debt ceiling by, having government guaranteed debt. That government guaranteed debt doesn't even go to Parliament. The PAC doesn't even pick it up, because it doesn't go to Parliament. Because it doesn't go to Parliament because there's no requirement that GLC debt. And now we know that, for example, the single largest thing is Dana Infra, where you basically give away contracts to cronies, and perhaps in the name of Bumiputra policies. But actually, who gets it? When you have something like ECRL, for example, which is going to cost on paper over 80 billion. And in fact, if you ask any of your serious engineering friends, it is probably, even with the tunnel, it would have cost about 20 billion. Without the tunnel now, it should cost less. Yeah. Okay? You get the country indebted and nobody cares, because why? You postpone the principal requirement. So I think what we really have is a problem where the politicians, and particularly from the ruling coalition, have been very successful. I mean, we have to recognize that Najib has a certain genius, okay, and his genius is through smoke and mirrors. And you cannot fight that unless you have an alternative narrative. And Hwok Aun has reminded us that you actually did have an alternative narrative, but you didn't live up to the narrative. In 2018. So I think it is important for us to recognize this. And I think what Malacca teaches us now is that, you have a situation where the Pakatan Harapan is being perceived, rightly or wrongly, as threatening to Bumiputras, to Malays. And there is an urgent need to reverse that perception through concrete proposals which would actually impinge on the lives of many people, and to demonstrate that you live up to it. It's no point just saying something in a manifesto, for example, and then when you come into power, say, oh, we cannot afford healthcare financing right now, or we cannot afford this right now, and so on and so forth. And then you do the easy things like cut GST without coming up with alternative revenue sources and so on. So I think we need to be, I know it's difficult for a sitting politician to be sort of self-critical, but at least implicitly self-critical, to recognize the problems and the need to begin to address them by offering an alternative narrative which will actually mobilize the people. I still do think that there is hope, but there is a need to recognize that whatever you might think about Tun Mahathir, you know, he has a point in saying that, you know, if you do not recognize the need for almost separate Malay mobilization, then you're basically in trouble. And this is why I think, you know, you cannot just wish away half a century of, you know, when people are able to walk around even without crutches, but if you believe that the only way you can walk around is with a crutch, you know, you just can't just take away that crutch and expect people to you know, who believe that whatever little that they have achieved has been because of that crutch. You really need to have a weaning away program and so on. And this is the basic problem which we have in Malaysian politics, an inability to recognize and to offer an alternative political narrative. And that's why I think the only effective way of combating ethnopopulism is through an alternative discourse, a progressive populism. You know, many people are now talking about so-called Marhainism and all that. But whatever it is, whatever works needs to be done, and it needs to be done urgently. Otherwise, unfortunately, Pakatan Harapan will be, for them, you know, will be an unfortunate blip in Malaysian political discourse. But more importantly, we are going to have a situation where we will continue go down this merry road, which actually leads nowhere. It really leads nowhere because the country can never progress with this. I think this is the difficult challenge which we face ahead, and this is why I appreciate the fact that, you know, IDEAS and Hwok Aun have you know, engaged us in this debate. But we need to recognize that, you know, beyond the immediate issues, you know, there is a larger issue at stake, and that is the fact that we cannot just wish away half a century or more of ethnopopulism. And that ethnopopulism, I would argue, goes back at least 7 decades, you know, if not more. And, you know, and without getting into all that right now, I think it's important for us to recognize that. Let me stop there.
Prof. Jomo, what you're saying is it's going to be hard for us to move away from this fixation on ethnicity, is what you're saying.
Not just hard, but you need to accept that, you know, everybody has accepted it, whether you're for or against it. That's Hwok Aun's message. You know, we can't get away from that discourse, and we shouldn't. And no serious politician should actually try to. No serious politician should try to get away from that discourse in the short term. The question is, how do you demonstrate, you know, while recognizing that those discourses unfortunately do exist, how do you demonstrate and that an alternative discourse can go forward? I mean, this is a situation which we have. I mean, there was a time, for example, from the mid-1950s when Pauh offered an alternative discourse, you know, under the leadership of Dr. Burhanuddin. Dr. Burhanuddin was arrested under the Internal Security Act, together with the leader of the chair of the Labour Party, Pak Sako, Ishak Haji Muhammad, who actually lives in Dr. Ong's constituency, who used to live there. And Ahmad Bustamam, the leader of the Partai Rakyat Malaya at that time. And a former UMNO minister, Aziz Ishak, who was the Minister of Agriculture and Cooperatives. They all were detained in 1964 under the Internal Security Act. You know, there is a historic. I mean, this year we're giving the Nobel Prize to Maria Ressa, but 1961, you know, 60 years ago, there was a heroic strike for over 100 days by the workers of Utusan Melayu. What was the strike over? The strike wasn't over more gaji for the workers. The strike was over the independence of Utusan Melayu, which was facing an UMNO takeover. But now we have this discourse, you know, that, you know, Tunku Abdul Rahman was such a liberal and so on and so forth. In fact, there was a great deal of repression going on in the 1960s, which eliminated this discourse, which I think is so essential for Malaysia to go forward.
Okay. Prof. Sulo, given that that poverty will remain a challenge, social restructuring will continue to be controversial, where do you see this going forward for Malaysia?
One of the things that is very significant to observe is that you have to see where in a policy document certain issues sit and whether there is a separate allocation or separate section of, I'm talking about the 12th Malaysia Plan. And what is it was striking for me in the 12th Malaysia Plan is that this whole discourse on the Bumiputra economic community and economic participation, Bumiputra, sits in the poverty chapter. And to me, it is like one of the target groups. And this is actually very striking for me because you see, if you put it together with, if you don't have a separate discussion or separate debate on that, then it can get subsumed in another discussion. And as far as poverty is concerned, I think there has been a lot of progress because I'm involved in many of these poverty discussions. For example, they've brought in a multidimensional approach to poverty. Secondly, they have recognized the weaknesses of past approaches to poverty. And they've also recognized that the biggest problem where you're not getting any progress with poverty is because of implementation issues. And they've said, and also they've said that, I mean, I'm talking about the 12 Malaysia Plan and the discussions I've been in, that there's also a recognition that there must be data and everything must be data, but based on data, and there must be a centralized poverty data system, and the ICASE has got its own flaws. And also they've recognized the role of NGOs in poverty eradication, that the wealth of knowledge and data also rests with the NGOs, and they can play a useful role in poverty eradication. And this was very clear during the time of when the pandemic hit us, where there was a need for distribution of food parcels. And the government mechanism for distributing the food parcels was so expensive compared to the NGOs, which had sources, which had ways of distributing food aid to those who needed the food. And also where we go from here, I think we have also been set back quite a bit by the pandemic. When the M4, I mean, there's a very nice definition of the different categories of T1, T2, top 20, the M40 and the B40. But what has happened is that many of the M40 has actually come into the B40 category, and thus increasing the pressures of trying to do something for the B40. Okay, if you want to aid the B40 and that's the target of your poverty elevation programs, I have no issues with that. But again, the B40 are not a homogeneous group. The bottom end of the B40, the hardcore poor, required different kinds of intervention, because in the past it was basically blanket strategies for all poverty groups and hoping that you will be able to elevate poverty, but that didn't happen. So there is recognition that there's a need, and in fact they are even talking about a tax and also a special unit to look at poverty, because when you look at rural and urban poverty, one stark difference is that at least in the case of rural poverty, that's the Ministry of Rural Development that's clearly in charge of dealing with rural poverty. In the case of urban poverty, you don't know who is in charge. And urban poverty is equally important as rural poverty, even though the incidences may be lower, but still, because you see, you're using a very narrow measurement of poverty. It's just a PLI, which actually basically is about income poverty, and that doesn't tell you very much. So this is the poverty discourse has to take a different form, and I think it is shaping up a little bit with various discussions. And the 12 Malaysia Plan has actually recognized many faults with the poverty strategies. And I'm quite optimistic that in the future there will be progress towards eradicating all kinds of poverty and its various manifestations.
Okay, Meera, can I just step in
Sure.
and complement what Prof. Sulo has said? My last comment before I go, because I need to hit the Parliament. I think to add to the conversation, a couple of things that I want to add. I talked about alternative models moving forward. The other two things I want to talk about is actually measurement and evaluation, because we do a very bad job in terms of monitoring and evaluation of the effectiveness of various government policies, including Bumiputra economic empowerment policies, BE policies, and also some of the other social and educational policies, welfare policies that was highlighted by Hwok Aun and Prof. Sulo. So moving forward, we actually need a better, tracking, monitoring, evaluation system, and this is where perhaps some academics and think tanks can contribute to this discussion in a more substantive way and give the politicians something to think about, and even give the civil service something to think about, in terms of models to follow. The other thing that I want to talk about is actually institutional capacity and also development of institutional strength. This is something that I think is missing in a lot of discussion on the NEP, including perhaps what Hwok Aun has said just now. Yes, the middle class Malays have grown in size and also in wealth. Yes, there's more Malays occupying occupations, professional occupations in our public universities and whatnot. But there's been very little discussion on, for example, one thing that's close to many people's hearts here, the institutional capacity of public universities as an example. Why is this an important thing? Because if you have weak institutional capacity at, let's say, the public universities as an example, what will happen is that the capacity of the academics and the students to be able to grow stronger from a publication standpoint, from a teaching ability standpoint, will be hampered, right? And the people who suffer the most from this are the majority, is everyone who goes to public universities, but the majority of whom are Malays and Bumiputras, So, I received cases of complaints about how there's a great academic fraud in our public universities, right? And the kind of instances that this has happened involves many academics who are majority Malay in these public universities on PhD students who are majority Malay, right? So, this kind of stuff doesn't really get highlighted a lot. And I think it's part and parcel of the larger institutional framework that needs to be discussed. And many of the Malay middle class knows about these problems. They just need these problems to be channeled and to be highlighted in a public way, and also to find ways in which these can be addressed in a transparent manner. So I think just to complement some of the comments just now, I need to go off now. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kian Ming. Can we hear from Nurul, Izzah, Anwar? She's got shared some of her thoughts on a video. The team will actually play that for us now. Are we okay with the video?
Yes, it'll be out in just 2 minutes. Give us a second. Thanks.
NEP Beyond 50, assessing its strengths and weaknesses to chart a cohesive Malaysian society. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Hwok Aun for the launch of his excellent paper. It's exactly the kind of nuance we need to move beyond the current deadlock we have around the NEP, beyond the extremes of believing it must be done away with altogether because it favors the elites and neglects the poorest, and also the argument on the far end of the opposite spectrum who defend the NEP uncritically as an end-all, be-all solution to protecting the Malays. The truth, as they say, as outlined in Dr. Hwok Aun in his paper, lies somewhere in the middle. My main takeaway from the article is Malaysia's needs to apply a more nuanced approach to strategies like the NEP, that perhaps it's not helpful to rely solely on a universal approach without acknowledging the very real inequalities and structural disadvantages faced by different segments within the Malaysian society, be it women, hardcore poor, the disabled, and the Malays themselves, including the Bumiputra of Sabah and Sarawak. Keadilan first mooted, the People's Justice Party first mooted the idea to move away from a racially based measurement of poverty to one predicated on need. That was back in 2006, 2007, and it was an uphill struggle for predominantly Malay-led, albeit multiracial party. But it was an important start and a stark reminder that class, income level differences, as well as the different dimensions of poverty, lend credence to the importance of a more in-depth look at the struggle of alleviating poverty. What's important about Dr. Hwok Aun's paper is that it provides greater depth on the subject matter. The idea underpinning a needs-based instead of race-based aid disbursement policy is well-intentioned, and it's crucial to ensure that nobody is left behind. However, we must not be blind to how certain kinds of identities, for reasons we absolutely must explore, are sidelined from different types of opportunities. We must safeguard, certainly, the principle of equality for all, while fostering fairness in participation and representation. And this can be done by combining both universalism and a targeted approach to different segments. We had concluded, together with Professor Fatimah Kari, our own multidimensional poverty study in the constituency of Permatang, Pauh, and we were able to see how female-headed households, i.e. single mothers, for example, are far more deprived than their male-headed or standard households in every single dimension, with the exception to access to healthcare. If all poor households received the same amount of financial aid, then the principle of equality would have been upheld at the expense of being fair. But clearly, not everyone would be able to enjoy the fruits or such financial support because the needs vary significantly. Targeted measures need to be undertaken, specifically addressing the structural factors, the systemic weaknesses or types of needs that underlie the relative state of disadvantages and deprivation. And this is the only way we can somehow level the economic playing field. Identity is important, and you can't ignore this to champion solely needs-based policies or trumpet meritocracy. Who you are and where you come from certainly matters. And you can't treat everyone with the same universalism, but of course, you can try to introduce policies to make sure that the opportunity and the outcome by first plugging in the needs of their respective backgrounds. So we can see in the article how having affirmative action policies for Malays in itself is not a bad thing. In the same way, you have similar policies for female representation or scholarship training programs for the urban and rural poor. In agreeing with the notion that one needs to transcend the simplistic universalism of a needs-based approach, the MPI, the Multidimensional Poverty Index study, has demonstrated how some have suffered disproportionately more than others. Policies need to be designed with demographic specificity in mind in order to properly break the cycle. The paper also suggests refocusing on guaranteeing equality and fostering fairness instead of focusing on poverty reduction. I agree, poverty is more than just about being poor, and our current obsession with bringing down some arbitrary number ignores the simple fact that poverty is a symptom of a larger cause, deprivation. We focus on guaranteeing equality and fostering fairness. We address the real issues that affect people's lives, access to education, healthcare, and other types of opportunities. There was a sentence in the article that caught my attention. Dr. Hwok Aun said, principles stand a much better chance of survival, while policy targets change as powers come and go. We've witnessed many prime ministers over the past couple of years, and it's crucial for us to take a principle-centric or centered approach, as it allows us to be flexible in the way or with the way we tackle our goals, whether it's the 12 Malaysia plan or any mid to long-term goals, while still remaining on the problems that need solving. I think the paragraph that also encapsulates the main ideas emanating from Dr. Hwok Aun's thoughts and analysis is when he asks us, as we move forward, to go beyond such sweeping and get-ridden prescriptions, which are rooted in a zeal to dispense with the NEP's second prong while cleaving to the first. Poverty, alleviation, or meritocracy do not override policies that take into account identity, whether based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. The NEP's exclusive framing on ethnicity is too limiting. Likewise, its implementation need not be restricted to quotas and overt group preferences. I would just add that I firmly believe some of the recommendations brought by groups such as Khazanah Research Institute, pushing for universality in terms of according children with benefits, will also help break the current class differences that exist across segments. So the point is really not to restrict the policy approaches and not to assume that one or two piecemeal measures will resolve a long-standing systemic problem. So we do not need to integrate many factors, but allow me to offer my sincere congratulations on the launch of this article. We should really be having a more analytical approach on policies in this country, not to fear reprisals, not to fear the political backlash, because it really is the impetus that we need to meaningfully reform our policies to address inequality. I'm sorry for not being able to be with you today. I will have to continue my work in the PAC at the same hour, at the same time. But again, thank you and have a great discussion. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam hormat.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nurul, Izzah. Thank you, Nurul, Izzah. Our future Prime Minister, perhaps, I don't know. Very forward-thinking views. Somebody who could possibly put all of this into motion, but as Prof. Jomo has said, it's not going to be as easy as it sounds. Prof. Jomo, one of the things I want, sorry, before that, Hwok Aun, would you like to sort of share your thoughts on Nurul Izzah's message and her thoughts?
Yeah, I wish she was here to thank her personally, but yeah. We do appreciate that very much. I appreciate that, you know, she was a thoughtful reading, considering what I had written, and I think also grasping, because I do acknowledge that sometimes the perspective I bring is a little bit unusual, a bit out of the ordinary. It doesn't really subscribe. It doesn't neatly fit into particular categories. But I think, yeah, to you know, well, it's encouraging to me, I guess, that you know, it can be sufficiently understood, and that there is some significant ways that we can rethink, and then to branch away from the current polarity and fixation on race, only broadening it to identity, and then the universalism and group targeting. So yeah, I think if only there will be more, more politicians who would engage in this way. Yeah, I know the word nuance is used quite a bit, and I don't deny that. Yeah, we need that, and that there are nuances. But this is a clumsy word, right? But the what I prefer to describe the approach that we should take is to be more systematic. That is right to just have things properly mapped out and framed. Because nuance is capturing just like, okay, just be more delicate and not be too decisive or firm. But I think we can be. I think with being systematic can strive to be quite firm as well. Of course, there will be nuances, but to me, what drives me and what I strive for is a more systematic approach.
Prof. Jomo, I think what worries me is this whole idea of ethnicity, that we are caught up with the narrative, as you spoke about. My biggest concern is it's overshadowed by the realities of the international economic order. Are we doing ourselves injustice by being too inward-looking and looking after the sentiment of everybody internally when we're losing out on a more global platform? How do we strike that balance?
You're absolutely correct, Meera. The problem we have in this country is that we are so fixated on navel gazing that we really do not recognize how the world has changed around us. And for example, I mean, at the Malaysian contribution at the meeting in Glasgow on climate change, the applause was on the fact that the minister delivered his message in Malay, with very little recognition of the challenges which we face. In fact, one of the two elements in his speech, which was otherwise quite good, were actually irrelevant to the whole question of climate change. We get carried away with these kinds of things instead of addressing where we stand in the world today. We are now entering very new challenges in the world with a prospect of a new Cold War. How do we negotiate that? Do we negotiate that on the basis of having chummy relations with the president of this or the ruler of that? Or do we try to address it on a more principled basis? And this is where I think there's a huge difference between, say, Tun Razak and his son, Najib Razak. Tun Razak espoused way back in '67, having a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality in Southeast Asia, which came to fruition in 1973. And instead, our foreign policy, is how well we get along with so and so, whether our whether so and so wants to meet us, and that kind of thing. It's a very, very different world we live in, and it's all very nice to go out and pay a lot of money to go and play golf with the president of the US and so on and so forth. But we have to be more principled, and in a sense, there was a brief period during the 1990s, perhaps, when we got much more of a sense of that. With the Wawasan 2020, we were thinking about creating a Bangsa Malaysia. We were aspiring to something better. There was Malaysia Boleh became a national slogan, popularly accepted, not foisted from above. And all this made a big difference. And that was lost, unfortunately, by, in 1997 with the Asian financial crisis, which we just cannot blame others for. Policies were made, which were undertaken, which unfortunately led to the Asian financial crisis. The Asian financial crisis was largely due to international circumstances. But we have seen two very major challenges which we face: the climate change and the whole question of, for example, the pandemic, where we are, we are really punching below our weight. So we have unfortunately, very, very narrow preoccupations. And even when we deal with the world, we do not learn from the lessons of how people have handled similar challenges, albeit differently. And this is why I appreciate Hwok Aun's other work as well, where he compares with South Africa, where he compares, he doesn't do it, but others have done it. For example, comparing with India, where you have pro-caste policies. These are uncontroversial in South India, for example, where a century ago, people like Periyar, had an anti-casteist movement. But in North India, I mean, casteism is alive and well, and the basis for the ruling coalition, which plays on a different type of what I call ethno-populism. It's a casteism plus Hindu chauvinism and so on and so forth. So we need to recognize the commonalities of all this, but also to recognize that you can't just wish it away. People have been oriented, people like the Trump followers have grown up, thinking of presuming white privilege, and if you simply threaten them by saying, know this, know that, you are going to have a situation where the backlash, which we saw on January 6th of this year, can take place. So we really need to begin to have a different type of politics, a principled politics, and this to some extent is represented by people like Bernie Sanders and others. But we really need to articulate this. And unfortunately, we had that opportunity, and that opportunity was lost. Not simply because of the Sheraton move and all that. That opportunity was squandered, and this is the challenge I was putting to Dr. Aung, and hopefully Nurul Izzah. Well, Nurul Izzah's intervention recognizes some of those challenges, and Dr. Aung, to be fair, also does recognize this. But I think there's much to be learned from Hwok Aun's contributions, and unfortunately, many of these things are not. We are not engaging with many of the people who should. I mean, who are the ideologues of Keluarga Malaysia, or is it an empty slogan? We should be engaging with them. If we are serious about Keluarga Malaysia, what does it mean? Now, you can, of course, dismiss the Prime Minister and say that, but this was a Prime Minister who, when he was a student leader, appealed on a multi-ethnic basis and got elected as president of the student union, precisely because of that multi-ethnic appeal. Now, you can say maybe this was simply opportunism, but we have seen this in many other things. But people may be opportunistic, but it's only part of their character. There are also other things, and I think it's important to recognize we cannot want a perfect world. We need to build a better world. That's what we can hope for. And it requires a great deal of a mutual understanding. And we really need to begin to we cannot just say, oh, let's all dream the same dreams, because our whole histories are so different. And the way we see the world is so different, but we need to work harder. And this is why I think I appreciate this series of discussions which we are having, and Hwok Aun's contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. So many thoughts have been bandied around. Prof. Sulu, where should we even start? And I'm going to come back to you, Prof. Jomo. Where do we even start? I mean, you've spoken about, everybody coming on and having the same ambitions and all of that. But where do we start, given our scenario today?
When I sit back and think about what's happening with Malaysia, and I often ask myself the question, because I've been away from here for a bit, for about 4 months, I was somewhere else. And I keep asking myself, is there any hope left for Malaysia on the political front and on other fronts? And I'm not very optimistic on the political front, but I think there are still things in Malaysia that can be salvaged. And there are people who want to do something for the good of the people that they deal with. For example, I think there are good politicians, and they just want to do their work and they want to do something for their constituency. And you see some of that. And I think that's what gives me a little bit of hope for the country. And the other thing that just now when Nurul Izzah was talking, She was talking about the realities on the ground as far as poverty is concerned. And I've always been saying that poverty should not just be the government's responsibility, it should be everybody's responsibility. And if you believe in the power of one, that one person can make a difference, I think everyone should contribute something. There's some move to say that the private sector should contribute. But why should the private sector contribute, and in what form is that? And what are they going to get in return for contributing to the development agenda of the country, number one. And also my other work, working with an NGO, basically because we do good on the ground, we are showing results, we find that funds come looking for us. And we are slowly, after 10 years, we are slowly beginning to be recognized as an organization that is doing good work on poverty on the ground. And our communities, the communities that we deal with, are doing fairly okay. I wouldn't say perfectly well, but fairly okay. And we do different kinds of policies and programs for different groups. And this is what I've been trying to get through to the policymakers, that you cannot have a blanket approach, because every person in poverty is different. Their needs are different. The causes of their poverty are different. And we are at the stage in Malaysia where we can afford a more individualistic approach to reaching out to the poor. Because the poor in the Klang Valley, in the urban areas of the Klang Valley, may require different things from the poor in Kedah and Kelantan. And the amount of aid that is needed because of things like cost of living, cost of housing, cost of acquiring various inputs are all different. And this is where we in Malaysia are at a stage where we can afford to be a little more targeted in who we want to deal with. And of course, the monitoring and the evaluation is very, very important. That's what even Ming said earlier, because the monitoring and evaluation really is so horrible. I've been involved in projects where we start at the macro level and we see, and we are told that, certain amount of aid has gone to a certain constituency, a certain community. And when we go to the ground, we find that the whole village has disappeared. Where on the record is shown that that village has been a recipient of a substantial amount of money. And where is this money gone? So the monitoring and evaluation has to occur at all levels, and there must be a way of tracking that, a good tracking system to say that if you have given 100 ringgit, where has that 100 ringgit gone? It is not so difficult. You can put it into there are various ways of tracking, but it's a question of a very, what do you call it? A very disaggregated approach to poverty eradication, and also a very disaggregated, and there's so many agencies, so many organizations that are involved in poverty eradication that nobody knows who is in charge, nobody knows where to ask. And the other thing that I want to also say is that there are lots of good policies on paper, and there are a lot of programs that have been churned out for the benefit of various groups. But the thing is, there's not enough awareness, and a lot of people on the ground are not aware of what their entitlements are. And very, very often when we ask people on the ground, are you aware that you are entitled to get this benefit from this agency? They say they've never heard of it.
Yeah.
So where is the support?
Yeah. Prof. Sulo, you say poverty is everyone's responsibility, but if I can ask you to start with one place to fix these issues that you have just mentioned, would you then say it's our politicians?
No, I think it's politicians are there and they come and go. I think it's mainly the policymakers and the policymakers at different levels of the bureaucracy, because when you look at programs and that have been allocated with very clear criteria of who should be getting it, the chances are that program will reach the group that is intended for. Okay. But when the criteria for inclusion are very vague, and it's very politically motivated, then I think it's very difficult to actually see who is getting the benefits. Is it somebody who supports the politician or the policymaker who gets the benefits? And I think this is very important. So I think it is basically politicians at one level, but I think it's more the policymakers, and the policymakers across the spectrum, right down from the federal to the state to the district level. And I think this is where we had good systems in place. If you look at the Tun Razak's time, the Red Book Plan and things like that, there were good tracking mechanisms, and you could go to any district office and see, okay, how many roads have been built, how many were supposed to have been built, etc., and where the poverty areas are. But a lot of this is getting lost along the way, and this is my concern.
Okay. Sure. Prof. Jomo, how do we let go of prevailing mindsets and sort of shine a spotlight on fairness? How do we do that?
I'm afraid that's going to be the tall order. I mean, we've been stuck with this for about 70 years or more. And I think the easiest way for me is for people to begin to realize where all this came from, that it has not always been this way, that it can be different. So an appreciation, not an academic appreciation of history, but an appreciation of our past is important. Unfortunately, it's very, very difficult because we cannot get people to reflect back easily. Children are not in touch with their parents, let alone their grandparents, because it is the grandparents who will remember a time when things might have been different. So the other resource, of course, is to look at alternative discourses, and we see that there are alternative discourses which are taking place right now among young people, especially. Among a lot of people, for example, Name We is one example, but there are others as well. If you look at some of the younger Malay musicians and so on, they are talking differently. So I think it is to begin to give voice to that, to amplify those voices. We are all in different bubbles, unfortunately. The English language, sort of liberal bubble, which we are in right now, is so different from many other let's say non-Malay bubbles, as well as non-liberal Malay bubbles. And I think it is very important for us to recognize the insularity of all these bubbles. That is very important, but it's easier said than done, So the only way, I think, is, what you have been doing in BFM, for example, Meera, is important in terms of opening up discussions, but much more needs to be done, and much more needs to be done sort of almost consciously and purposefully. And this can only be done through the appropriate use of media, the creative use of media. And here I'm always learning from younger people, and there are different ways of doing things, but we need to recognize that we need to have these challenges, and it's very difficult to challenge the dominant discourses now. It seems easier because of social media, but even social media. I'm on a few groups which I don't have time to read, but when I do have the occasional chance to look at some of these groups, you would think that these are completely different discourses. These are almost different countries at different time eras and so on and so forth. And this is going to be very difficult. So having influential media trying to help to change the discourse. And it's very interesting that, say, Dr. Hushamuddin, for example, the Karangkraf, a founder and all that. He has committed himself to doing much more of this. Najib's younger brother, Nazir, you might find that his talk about reviving, having a new National Consultative Council a bit tiresome, but the point is that he is doing it with some good intent. So we need to be able to transcend some of these different discourses which are already taking place, and try to encourage the positive elements going forward. And the most important thing is to recognize our differences and to recognize and to begin that. But it's easy for me to say that. I'm a retired person. I talk to some people, not physically. I'm very isolated, actually, physically. But so there are people who are far more in touch with these different discourses, and they should be encouraged to respond to that. So we always talk, say BFM has more interesting or more serious discussions, but we need to recognize that there's a whole lot of media out there who also need to be reached. And you are probably better placed than I am to answer your own question in terms of influence and change these discourses. But taking a simple thing like food, if children could get one good meal a day in school, we would reduce malnutrition, we would improve physical development, we would improve cognitive development, and so on and so forth. This is why, and it was very disappointing that when Masli raised it in Parliament a couple of weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, he had almost no support from both sides of the aisle. So we have it's very, very sad. Many of the initiatives that Wan Azizah initiated in her capacity as Minister for Welfare, for example, have not gained ground. Nurul Izzah mentions, for example, the studies which my colleagues have done. Most people don't even know these studies. There's a Hawati, for example, has shown that there was considerable social mobility for the first 3 decades of the so-called NEP period. But since the end of the 1990s until now, there's been much less upward mobility, even our understanding of poverty. I mean, Professor Sulo is absolutely correct that we are kind of caught in our practices of the past. But how do we get beyond that? How do we get beyond that? The fact of the matter is that, according to my colleagues at KRI, about 20% of the population of this country cannot make ends meet. Okay, this is before the pandemic. Okay, and another 50%, they can make ends meet, but they are not able to save very much. In other words, before the pandemic, 70% of the population of this country couldn't even save anything significant. So it's a top 30%. But presume that the top 30% are fine and hunky-dory is a big presumption. And when we look more closely at that top 30%, how many of them, how did they fare during the pandemic period? Everybody in, say, something like in many of the hospitality industries, tourism, etc., they have been, their raison d'etre has been eliminated. Yeah. How are they going to recover in the new period? So we have a lot of challenges, but we have almost zero discussion going on in this country about how do we get out of this pandemic. We pat ourselves on the back by the number of people who have been vaccinated, and that's no mean achievement. I have to say that, but at the same time, we have not addressed so many other challenges which are pressing us, and I think so it's extremely important that the role of the media is important. and we're talking about the broadcast media, the print media, but also very importantly, peer discourses are important. And this is where I think Professor Sulo reminded us that what is happening on the village, in the village level, for example, with the AI, Amanah Hitam Malaysia initiatives, with the peer group monitoring and so on, becomes important. What is the universe of these of people who participate in that? What is their moral universe? Do they see Amanah Hitam Malaysia as part of affirmative action, as NEP and so on and so forth? They probably do. And so what does it mean when you say, oh, no more NEP, you know? And this is what Hwok Aun is trying to remind us of. Let me stop.
So do we roll back the NEP? And a lot of people are having that discussion. Should we roll back the NEP? Should we scrap it? Or should it just take a different form?
If you're asking me, I don't think it's a question of rolling back or not rolling back the NEP. This is precisely what Hwok Aun is telling us. You know, that kind of discussion is not going to get us very far. You know, and in fact, the NEP has become a major distraction which has prevented us from addressing a whole range of other problems which we face in this country. But because the NEP is such a major preoccupation of the population of this country, albeit from very, very different perspectives, what does it mean to insist on getting rid of the NEP or to insist on retaining the NEP? I think what needs to be done is, you know, changing the conversations about the NEP rather than insisting on a binary. Not making a pun on Sulo's university, on a binary solution of yes or no to the NEP.
Okay, so passing on to binary, would you have a message for us, Prof. Sulo?
I think the NEP is going to be with us for a very long time. It may not be called the NEP, but it will, as Hwok Aun has pointed out, it is not whether to perpetuate or to terminate it. But I think it's going to remain. And I think this, because it has been with us for 50 years. I didn't realize it's 50 years until I got Hwok Aun's paper and said, oh my God, it's 50 years that the NEP has been with us. So it's very difficult to, I mean, what is there a solid reason why you want to terminate it? Are you pandering to because there are different groups have different views about it, but I think would it be political suicide if the NEP is removed? I think it will be, because the Malays and the other Bumiputra identify the NEP as their savior, and the non-Bumiputra, some non-Bumiputra, I wouldn't say all non-Bumiputra, some non-Bumiputra think that the NEP is the cause of their current socioeconomic status, and other non-Bumiputra say, to hell with the NEP, I'm just getting on with my life, my business, and my occupation, whatever that is. And I'll just get on. If anything comes along my way, well and good. If it doesn't, I know how to manage. So I think there are different groups in the country that feel that I've got different views of the NEP. And some groups say that despite the NEP, I'm okay. It does not affect, because I can perform, I know how to live, and I know how to do my business. So it doesn't really affect me. So I think the NEP will be there for a long, long time, but it may not be called the NEP. And maybe another 50 years down the road, we may not even recognize it as the NEP. But if we look back at 100 years of the NEP, I think it will take a completely different form and shape. That's my.
Could I add to that?
Thank you. Yes, Hwok Aun. And can you conclude as well while you're at it?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to everyone for staying on. This has been very lively, very informative and robust. I would say first, if you agree with, if you advocate for poverty alleviation policies, then you would like the NEP to continue. Then you are advocating continue the NEP because it has two prongs. It is so fundamental, poverty alleviation for all is fundamental to the NEP. So it's just, it's really quite inane to be saying that get rid of the NEP, but keep doing poverty alleviation. Okay, so you only want to end the second prong of the NEP or particular. So my point is that, I mean, come on, just everyone really needs to just step back a bit, settle down a little bit, right? Do a little bit of, I mean, it doesn't have to be very academic, because it's a simple point here, really, that the NEP is about two things, right? The poverty alleviation and the social restructuring. And ask yourself whether these are still, relevant. And the poverty alleviation, we all agree, is. So there is this case about the NEP, maybe in different forms, continuing. And then, but I'm trying to propose, right, to cleave to the underlying principles and how they are actually more applicable today. So yes, poverty alleviation, but broader than that, right? Well-being for all on the basis of equality, and a whole other area that is about group targeting. So I just underscore that I hope that, if it can be a conversation, right, that can break away from the current deadlock, that, that is at least a certain contribution. But I think how to engage in that. So, I mean, the notions of seeking common ground and so on, I think are there, but in real sense, I think it's also about empathy. I think there's a bit of a zeitgeist issue here. I think maybe a generation, especially the young, right? It means a lot. It's increasingly, I think, something that is, the part of, maybe to use the term loosely, human condition of today. Sense of greater insecurity and wanting to be heard, wanting to be, to engage, right? And so I think it does have to involve that to some extent. And we have been speaking a lot about how, yes, and critiquing the dismissiveness towards those who are critiquing those who are dismissive, right, about Malay and Bumiputra anxieties, right, towards NEP and being removed, and I was saying that, look, there is a real basis, and we should acknowledge that, those are some quite reasonable reservations when people say things like, oh, need-based policies and instead of race-based. But I think on the other side as well, there is, there is a tendency in some circles to also be dismissive of minority concerns, right? And it derives from the same kind of misconceptions. They say that, oh, look, your income level is higher on average. You still have opportunity in the private sector. You can go to private universities. So why are you complaining? Now, those are all those can be are true. I mean, there's evidence to support that, but that doesn't change the fact that some opportunities are curtailed. There is still some element of unequal opportunity, and so we do have to, try to be more candid, try to be able to think about it, in a way that is systematic, that is recognizing the policy objectives and how they operate, and not just, be so quick to gravitate towards being pro or anti, and then, drawing those stark racial lines. And I think to build on some of everyone has said, but also I think Kian was more specific about needing to show something that is tangible. I think there are tangible ways, and there needs to be more public awareness that of the many ways that there is solidarity across all lines, right? It's a class also in terms of supporting it ethnically, and we can build on that. But I just do want to temper some expectations that I think right now there is a lot of galvanized, I think, efforts and interest and support for an agenda that is helping all, right, regardless of ethnicity and so on. And that is wonderful, but that does not mean, and it will be a grave mistake to think that just because we have consensus on all these policies, that we're easily going to find consensus on the harder issues regarding the very extensive Bumiputra policies, right? So I think, yeah, we don't assume that, but don't straight away as well, just fall back into the comfortable positions of being pro and against, but just grapple with it, I think, in a way that is also recognizing, right, the gender policies. I think sometimes when that draws into the picture, comes in, we pull it in and see that this is part of the same domain of policies. It can help lower the temperature a bit. People can see that, oh yeah, right, we are striving, these are policies that are striving for increasing diversity, increasing representation. It's recognizing structural disadvantage. You can't just say equal opportunity and then all these changes that you desire are going to take place. It takes some special measure that is targeted at a particular identity group, and then say that, well, that also applies to ethnicity, that applies to majority group, it can increasingly apply to minority groups as well. And yeah, I mean, it's back to the a bit of that the idealism, but I think this is also being quite pragmatic and trying as much as possible, to offer some real solutions and tangible solutions. Thank you.
Rest assured, the world needs more people like you, Hwok Aun. Just looking at our comment section and the Q&A section, we need more people like you. But for those of you who shared your comments, thank you very much. Unable to go through all of it. Our speakers had so much to share as well. But thank you for attending. Prof. Jomo, Professor Sulo, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I mean, it's a shame Kian Ming had to leave, and it's a shame that Nurul Izzah wasn't able to join us in person, but maybe the next time. I'm going to hand over to Vaishnavi for now.
Thank you, Meera. Thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in today, and to Hwok Aun for his valuable contribution to our project. We embarked on this project with the aim to have a discussion that was more that did more justice to the complexity of this topic. And I hope that today was an initiation of that discussion. Please don't stop the discussions. Please go home and have these conversations with your families, your friends, with your colleagues. And please do join for the next two webinars tomorrow and Friday, where we talk about social cohesion in the context of NEP, as well as the question of Bumiputera identity. If you would like to access Hwok Aun's full paper, you can go to ideas.org.my and download it there. And thank you very much, Meera, for your support today. Thank you to everyone. Have a good day, and thank you for joining.